this is weakening the US's technology ecosystem and strengthening China's technology ecosystem. And we're not seeing the US promote technology diffusion across our society as it should.
Under both Trump and Biden, containing China's power economically and militarily has been seen as a key strategic challenge for the US. Sweeping sanctions and restrictions on Chinese companies were introduced, the US wanting to hang on to an advantage as AI technology emerged. But does the recent financial market turmoil after a low cost Chinese startup announced a new AI model suggest those attempts have failed? I'm delighted to have as my guest today Scott Kennedy, a specialist in US China relations and business and a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Scott, thanks for being with us.
Happy to join you.
Before we get into that tech rivalry and how it might impact global security, we've seen Donald Trump announcing new tariffs on Chinese goods, as well as on Canada and Mexico. What's your sense of what's going through the minds of policymakers in Beijing and perhaps President Xi right now?
The Chinese know that President Trump is unpredictable, that he's a unilateralist. Um, they've had 4 years before of interacting with him, um, and it was a complex challenge for them, which they managed to muddle through, negotiating the Phase 1 trade deal in early 2020. Um, and in some ways, he offers an opportunity to them because President Trump doesn't prioritize human rights. He deprioritizes allies, and so he doesn't present that kind of ideological challenge with the U.S. together with its allies that the Biden administration presented. On the other hand, the unpredictability is very difficult. China depends a lot on foreign investment and trade, and predictability is really important to keep things going. My sense, though, is that the Chinese are ready, if necessary, to strike back. If they can't talk this out and delay tariffs, then they're going to respond with penalties of their own, either tariffs or sanctions on American companies or their own export controls. And then we'll see if that leads to a negotiation. I think probably what it will do is lead to a further escalation, and so we may get further away from a deal than we thought. And I think markets have been expecting U.S.-China tensions to stay relatively mild, and because everyone expects President Trump somehow to be rational and be worried about inflation. Well, I think they may be proven wrong. And as Mike Tyson said, you don't know how you're going to react till you get punched in the face. And it could be that the U.S. is about to get punched in the face by China, and then we may see President Trump pull out a whole variety of stops, and we may be nowhere near a deal. And I think that will make markets react quite negatively.
So beyond these worries about however a trade war might play out, we have a series of sanctions and restrictions already on China. You wrote a really interesting article back in November arguing that US sanctions on Chinese tech, trying to keep US dominance, to keep that on top of that rivalry, have backfired. How does the financial market turmoil we saw when DeepSeek was released, does that support your argument at all?
Well, the U.S. certainly has had a very decidedly mixed record on its ability to constrain China's technological progress. Remember, if you would, Stuart, the original motive here is not just simply straight out economic competition in tech. It is that the particular areas of technology that the U.S. wanted to impose restrictions on were directly related to military power, and that these are uh, adopted in for reasons of constraining China's ability to go to war and win a war with the U.S. or against its allies in a whole variety of different scenarios. And uh, I think in some areas you could say that the U.S. has made some progress. Certainly in semiconductors, the U.S. has slow China down, and same with semiconductor equipment. But broadly speaking, we've incentivized the Chinese to throw everything they've got at tech, and we've given them a blueprint of exactly where they need to invest because that's where we're restricting or we're planning to restrict. And they have incentivized Chinese industry to get involved like never before. And what we're seeing in the case of DeepSeek is one of those Chinese companies coming up with an innovation that others didn't expect. And what we now know is that no lead is safe in any part of this tech competition. Today, the Chinese look like they're doing really well with large language models and certain parts of AI. Tomorrow, we'll get news from OpenAI or Meta that shows progress that they have made, and the next week we'll see something from the Chinese, and it'll go back and forth. And we're going to see that in uh, green tech, we'll see it in medicine, we'll see it in lots of different areas. This is now a full on competition like it wasn't before. And I think it, it didn't need to be this way, but here we are.
So it didn't need to be this way. Is it that these sanctions have made China more innovative and perhaps more self-reliant than it would otherwise have been?
I think there's a couple things to say about this. Yes, I think in some ways what we've done is force the Chinese by saying to become more self-reliant because we've said you're not going to be able to depend on our technology or our markets or our finance or our workers to help you, our R&D. Um, and and so that has pushed them to increase their spending and focus and to, as they say, delete America from their technology stack across the as board as many places as they can. Uh, and then we've seen Chinese companies uh, get jump in even more enthusiastic than they ever did before. I think in addition to that, we're slowing. The U.S. is slowing itself down as well. So it's a two-way thing that not only is China being incentivized, the export controls which are restricting sales to China are overly broad. So we're restricting sales of things that really don't have any direct military benefit, um, but they're making it so that American companies have less revenue to pour back into R&D for greater innovation. We're restricting Chinese students, scholars, workers working and studying in the United States. Those are folks that would contribute to our innovation. We're restricting U.S. R&D in China. Again, we're seeding talent. I'll just give you an interesting example. I was in China a few weeks ago, and an American company told me that as they were withdrawing their R&D center from one city, the city's leaders went to the company and said, "Give me a resume of everyone who's in your company who will be out of a job. We promise to get a Chinese company to hire every single one of them." We're making other countries figure out how they can engineer around American technology as well, because they don't want to be caught in the crossfire as well. And then on the industrial policy side, the U.S. is pouring several $100 billion into industrial policy. We have a very bad industrial policy machine, and there will be some things that work, but we're going to have a lot of white elephants, and so we're going to throw away a lot of money in industrial policy as well. So, as not only are we incentivizing the Chinese in ways we hadn't before, in some ways we're also slowing down innovation in the United States. I think, in general, we could be in a better place in that competition, and also there are areas where we could collaborate, where we really do need to solve some problems together.
So clearly, major economic implications. What are the implications on national security for America uh, as a result of these sanctions backfiring?
That's going to be hard to say. If we're talking about technology leadership and what feeds into your the cutting edge, which then goes into your military prowess, the initial effect in the short term is probably not going to be that dramatically negative, and in some ways beneficial to the U.S. And probably that's what U.S. military and top policymakers care most about. But this is weakening the U.S.'s technology ecosystem and strengthening China's technology ecosystem. and we're not seeing the U.S. promote technology diffusion across our society as it should. In addition to the technology leadership question, it's really unclear to me that the U.S. is taking the kind of steps it really needs to ensure resilience for its supply chains and its critical infrastructure and other things that it needs to do in order to be prepared for some kind of conflict. So I think we're making some kinds of progress. This is not an all or nothing thing. I think the U.S. could just do a lot better, and so I'm worried that we're putting ourselves in a position that's going to be I think we're putting ourselves in a position where we'll be less capable and ready to if some scenario arises, or to make sure a crisis doesn't emerge.
What does the path look like where the US could ensure its dominance, or at least its technology leadership, as you say, in those areas most likely to hit global security? What does that
Yeah,
look like?
yeah. So I think of tech competition not like a boxing match. I think of it like a running race. So to some extent, slowing the other person down helps a little bit, but really what you need to do is get yourself faster. So you need to train in the gym. You need to lift weights. You need to get out and run intervals. You need to do long runs, and then you need to figure out how to win on race day, regardless of how fast the other racers go. So the U.S. really needs to invest in basic science research, broad-based education. It needs to invest in some areas of supply chain resilience where there are threats that one needs to be worried about, whether it's critical minerals or our energy grid. There's obviously some areas of data security and other things that pose real challenges to the United States. I would say we're going to need to do this with allies. If the economic security cannot be achieved by the U.S. doing it on its own, it has to be done in consultation and combination and partnership. And that's one of the things that the Biden administration got right. I'm a little bit worried looking at the first few weeks of the Trump administration that this is not one lesson that they came away with realizing that the Biden administration did something well. And so I'm really concerned that we're going to be less secure than we ought to be.
The military leader of one of those allies, Ukraine, has been warning that the future of war looks like AI-driven drones. Both drones and AI tech are big things that China is succeeding with right now. Is China getting an edge militarily with these cheaper chips, cheaper AI, and cheaper drones? Is that a worry?
I think the U.S. and China are both have world class militaries. The U.S. is much more battle tested through experience of combat in a whole variety of theaters around the world. China's developed a lot of capabilities that it hasn't tested yet. It's also developed a lot of asymmetric tools to respond that are in some ways less expensive than some of the technologies and systems that the U.S. has put together. I think what we have now is a rough balance of power where the costs of engaging in offensive war for either side is too high to really seriously consider. But there's still a possibility of some type of conflict emerging in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, or on the Korean Peninsula, or just some accident someplace that draws us in. So we have to be much better prepared than we are right now. And so, in addition, a lot of the sources of conflict are political in nature. And so getting to a point where we avoid war is also going to require some very nifty diplomacy. We have avoided war in the Taiwan Strait now for 7 decades or more, not just because of military deterrence and capabilities, but for the way that we have definitely helped avoid diplomatic confrontations, and we need to continue to do that in the Taiwan Strait and elsewhere.
The man who perhaps will be most associated with this diplomatic push, as you put it, is Donald Trump. He's called this a Sputnik moment, that point in the 1960s where we saw rocket boosters on the US space program to kind of keep that technology leadership. What do you think is going to happen next? What's coming down in the next months and years?
You know, I think that the U.S. and China likely are, for the foreseeable future, going to be rivals, broadly speaking. Um, they have very different economic and political systems. They are now uh, preparing for potential conflict with the other as their most likely opponent in multiple different kinds of scenarios. They have leaders, whether that's Trump now or Biden before, in both places believe that they are winning the competition. China thinks that capitalist systems and the American democratic experiment are showing a lot of their weaknesses, and was watching this uh, empire basically dissolve in front of it and just sort of going through the last gasps. The U.S. is looking at a very weak Chinese economy and criticism of Xi and the system, and thinking that China has also got problems. But actually, both sides have an amazing amount of staying power. At the same, and so I think we're going to see this competition endure for some time. Um, I think what I don't know is how volatile this is going to get. To what extent will we be able to continue to have interdependent economies and societies? Right now, it looks like we are gradually, inch by inch, uh, decoupling. I don't know if we're going to be able to keep connectivity, and if we do decouple, whether it's going to be primarily China that gets isolated, the U.S. gets isolated, or something in between. Um, and then in terms of war, I just don't know if we're going to be able to, you know, I don't see a really great reason to start World War III. And I hope Washington and Beijing would agree. But it's going to, again, it's going to take a lot of, of efforts and some sensitivity to the red lines of the other side to do this. So I really think that we're at a turning point, which we could go in a variety of different directions. This sort of Cold War, slow burning rivalry could continue, or things could get, much hotter. In fact, and quite suddenly, I think the soothing scenario of somehow the U.S. and China uh, kissing and making up, and establishing some kind of grand bargain where we find a way to cooperate across the board. I think we're long past that right now. The question is, can we manage these tensions? That is a giant question. It's why I go to work every day to try and figure out how we can avoid conflict and promote maintenance of the rules based order. But that's far from assured.
Finally, is there a danger this decoupling that you touch on leads to perhaps the US losing its dominance of global standards, of the rules-based order, and all of that kind of disintegrates as a result of the world pushing into perhaps two or more blocks?
I think, Stuart, it is a guarantee that a U.S. in a decoupled world is less powerful and less dominant than in a divided world. Just let's start very simply in the auto sector. So, China for 40 years had been trying to catch up in autos, and it hadn't, because it was in these joint ventures that were developing, really led by American, European, Asian companies around the internal combustion engine. That was the technology, and that everyone was dependent on. China started developing EVs. The West did not jump into EVs fast enough, and we got caught with our pants down. And now the Chinese are way ahead in electric vehicles and batteries and the whole supply chain. In addition to that, everyone has been working on connected vehicles, autonomy, other ways in which vehicles connect to the internet to share data, so you can order a pizza on your way home, or whatever you'd like to eat. And as a result, the U.S. has decided that there's a data security risk that comes along with cars. And so the Biden administration, as it was walking out the door, issued a final rule on connected vehicles that are produced in China, basically banning them from the American market in the coming years. That is going to ripple through the global auto industry, and we're going to have two auto sectors, one that's China compatible and one for the rest of the world. And we don't know how big those spheres are going to be. Right now, China's auto market is 6x the US. A lot of the developing world, Southeast Asia, Europe, Australia, import Chinese cars, and now the Chinese are investing in building cars in those countries. Uh, it's quite possible the China sphere for the auto sector will be much larger, and that the U.S. sphere, because of the fear about China as well as its allergy toward electric vehicles, might end up being much more slowly developed because of that division and protectionism. And so I think there it's almost a guarantee that the U.S. is going to cede leadership to China. And you can look at biopharma and medical devices. You can look at a lot of different areas where a divided world gives China the opportunity to fill a vacuum that the U.S., Europe, and our Asian allies once dominated. And so I'm really concerned that this is going to be a world that's much less favorable to our technology, to our values, than we've had in a long time.
It's incredibly fascinating stuff. Scott, thank you so much for making some time for us today.
Good speaking with you.